My name is Robert Mitchell, and this happened to me in the summer of 1964. I still get chills thinking about it, even now. Sometimes at night, I hear those voices again, calling from the darkness. And I have to remind myself that I am far away from that cursed valley in West Virginia. I was a geology professor back then, excited about spending the summer doing research in the Appalachian Mountains with my family. My wife Laura, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, had finally managed to get time off. Our kids, David and Alice, weren't too happy about leaving their friends behind, but we promised them it would be an adventure. If only we had known what kind of adventure it would turn into. We packed our station wagon with enough supplies to last us through the summer: tents, sleeping bags, food, and all my research equipment. The drive was long and the kids kept asking, "Are we there yet?" every 15 minutes. Laura just smiled and handed them sandwiches whenever they got too restless. She was always good at keeping everyone happy. The trouble started as soon as we turned onto the dirt road leading into Hollow Creek Valley. A thick fog seemed to appear out of nowhere, wrapping around our car like ghostly fingers. Alice pressed her face against the window, saying the fog looked like it was dancing. David, trying to act grown up at 14, just rolled his eyes at his little sister, but I noticed how he kept glancing nervously out the window too. The valley itself was like something from another world. Ancient trees towered above us, their branches tangled together to block out most of the sunlight. The fog never lifted, even in the middle of the day. It just hung there, turning everything gray and misty. Through the fog, I could make out the dark shapes of old mining equipment scattered around, rusty carts, broken tracks disappearing into the hillside, and what looked like the remains of an old processing plant. We set up our camp in a small clearing near where I planned to study the rock formations. Laura helped me put up the tents while the kids explored nearby, but not too far, we made sure of that. Everything was fine that first evening. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets chirping in the darkness. That's how it began, just a normal family research trip. We had no idea that those crickets would soon be replaced by other sounds, sounds that shouldn't exist, sounds that would change our lives forever. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the warning signs, the way the birds suddenly went quiet in the middle of the day. The strange circles of mining equipment we found, arranged too perfectly to be random. And most of all, I should have listened when Alice first told us about the voices she heard calling from the woods. But I was too excited about my research, too focused on the unusual rock formations I'd discovered, too rational to believe in the impossible, until the impossible came looking for us. It was our third day in the valley when we met Old Bill. I was taking measurements of a strange rock formation, smooth and spiral-shaped, unlike anything I'd seen before, when I heard a twig snap behind me. I turned around to find an old man watching us from between the trees. His white beard was long and messy, and his clothes were worn out, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You folks shouldn't be here," he said quietly, stepping into our clearing. "This ain't no place for children." Laura quickly called David and Alice to her side. They had been playing nearby, collecting interesting rocks for my research. "I am Bill," the old man continued, leaning on a wooden walking stick. "Been living in these parts for nigh on 50 years. Seen things. Bad things." He looked directly at Alice, who was hiding behind Laura's leg. "You been hearing them yet, little one? The voices?" Alice's eyes went wide. She nodded slowly. "How did you know?" I asked, moving closer to my family. The fog seemed to thicken around us, making everything look gray and distant. Old Bill shook his head sadly. "They always start with the young ones, calling to them, pretending to be their friends." He pointed his stick toward a dark opening in the rocks nearby. "These caves, they go deep, deeper than any mining company ever mapped. And what lives down there?" He stopped, looking around nervously. "They're hungry, always hungry." I wanted to laugh it off as the ramblings of a lonely old man, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. And when Alice whispered, "They sound like children, Daddy. They want me to play with them," I felt my heart skip a beat. "Pack up," Bill said firmly. "Pack up and leave while you still can, before they learn your voices." He turned and started walking away, then stopped. "And whatever you do, don't follow the sounds. No matter who they sound like, no matter what they promise, they ain't what they seem." We watched him disappear into the fog. David tried to act tough, saying the old man was just trying to scare us. But later that night, as we sat around our campfire, we all jumped when we heard it. A child's laugh, echoing from somewhere in the darkness, followed by what sounded like someone calling my name. That's when I noticed the mining equipment. In the firelight, I could see that the old rusty carts and pieces of track hadn't just been abandoned randomly. They were arranged in perfect circles, all pointing toward the cave entrance old Bill had warned us about. I wanted to leave right then, but a heavy storm moved in the next day. The rain made the dirt road too muddy for our station wagon. We were stuck, at least until the ground dried up. I told myself it would be okay. We just had to be careful and stay together. But Alice started changing. She would sit by herself, whispering to someone we couldn't see. When Laura asked her who she was talking to, Alice smiled in a strange way. "My new friend," she said. "She looks like me, but her eyes are different. She says she's been here a very long time." One morning, I woke up to find Alice's bed empty. My heart nearly stopped until I heard her giggling outside. She was sitting cross-legged near the cave entrance, holding something in her hands. "Alice?" I called out, running to her. "What are you doing out here alone?" She opened her hands to show me a small, weird-looking rock. It was perfectly round and had tiny spiral patterns all over it, just like the bigger formations I'd been studying. "My friend gave it to me," she said. "She says there are more inside the cave. She wants to show me." I took the rock and threw it as far as I could into the fog. Alice started crying, but not like a normal child. The sound was hollow, like it was coming from far away. That night, she spoke in her sleep, but the words didn't sound like English, or any language I'd ever heard. David tried to act brave through all of this, but I could tell he was scared. He started sleeping with his flashlight on. "Dad," he told me one morning, "I keep hearing someone calling my name. They sound just like you and Mom, but different somehow." I made a new rule. Nobody goes anywhere alone, not even to the bathroom. We started planning to leave as soon as the road dried up. But then other campers arrived, a family with 2 kids about the same age as David and Alice. They set up their RV on the other side of the clearing. That night, we heard screaming from their campsite. By the time I got there with my flashlight, the RV was empty. Their car was still there, the doors wide open, dinner half-eaten on their table. They'd just vanished. And David couldn't take his eyes off the cave. "Don't you hear that, Dad?" he kept asking. "They're calling us. They need help." I should have watched him more carefully. I should have known what was coming. But how could I watch both children every second? How could I know that the next morning, when the fog rolled in thicker than ever, my son would disappear too? The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. Laura and I searched everywhere, screaming David's name until our voices gave out. Alice just sat in her tent, rocking back and forth, still whispering to her invisible friend. When I asked her if she knew where David was, she looked at me with empty eyes. "He went to see them," she said in a flat voice. "They showed him the way." I ran to old Bill's cabin, stumbling through the fog. Inside, I found stacks of old newspapers going back 50 years. Every few years, the same story. Missing children, disappeared campers, families that vanished without a trace. All in this valley. Bill was sitting in an old rocking chair, not surprised to see me. "Found my research, did you?" he said quietly. "Been collecting those stories since my own Jenny disappeared back in 19. She was only 8. He stood up slowly. "But I found out what takes them, watched them, studied them. They're old, Professor. Older than the mines, older than the mountains themselves." He pulled out a dusty leather journal and handed it to me. Inside were detailed drawings of creatures I can't even describe properly. Things that looked almost human, but wrong somehow. The journal belonged to a miner from 1902 who wrote about finding something deep in the caves that could copy voices perfectly. They feed on souls, Bill explained, his voice shaking. Young souls especially, fresh and full of life. They take their time, drawing children in slowly, learning their voices, their thoughts, their dreams. Then they take them down into the deep places. I heard Laura screaming back at camp. When I got there, she was standing over something she'd found near the cave entrance, a pile of old bones, decades old, children's bones. And nearby, scratched into a rock, was a message in David's handwriting. Dad, help me, I am lost. That's when Alice started speaking in that strange language again. But this time her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded ancient and hollow, like it was echoing up from somewhere deep underground. And all around us, from every direction in the fog, we heard David's voice calling for help. But each voice was slightly different, slightly wrong. Laura grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Robert, she whispered, look at the fog. The thick mist was moving now, swirling into shapes that almost looked human. And in the cave entrance, I saw something shifting in the darkness. Something that had my son's face, but not his eyes. Never his eyes. Old Bill appeared beside us, holding an ancient-looking oil lamp. Here is only one way to save him now, he said, pulling out the old journal. The miner who wrote this, he found a way. A ritual. But the price. He looked at me sadly. Someone has to take their place. A willing soul. Laura grabbed my arm. No, she whispered. There has to be another way. But I knew. Deep in my heart, I knew what I had to do. The fog was getting thicker, and now we could hear dozens of voices. Some children, some adults, all calling out in terror and confusion. Among them was David's voice, getting fainter by the second. Take care of them, I told Laura, hugging her tight. Then I looked at Alice, who was staring at the cave with those strange empty eyes. Alice, honey, look at me. For a moment, I saw my little girl again, fighting to come back. Old Bill led us into the cave, reading from the journal by lamplight. The walls were covered in spiral patterns that seemed to move in the flickering light. We found David in a chamber deep underground, curled up in a corner. But when he turned to look at us, his face kept changing. Like something else was trying to wear it like a mask. The ritual has to be done here, Bill said, pointing to a circle carved into the floor. Ancient symbols ran around its edge. Step inside, speak the words from the journal, and offer yourself in exchange. I could feel them watching us from every shadow. The hollow people, the voice stealers. They looked like everyone they'd ever taken, all mixed together in impossible ways. Laura held Alice close as I stepped into the circle. The words from the journal were hard to pronounce, but as I spoke them, the symbols on the floor began to glow with a pale blue light. David's body jerked like a puppet on strings, and something dark started pulling away from him like smoke. The pain was, I can't describe it, like my soul was being torn apart. But I kept reading, even as I felt them trying to take me. I saw David's eyes clear, becoming his own again. Laura ran to him, pulling him back toward the cave entrance. Go, I screamed. Don't look back. The last thing I saw was Alice turning at the cave entrance. She smiled, not her empty smile from before, but her real one. My little girl was back. Then the darkness took me. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I woke up 3 days later in a hospital 50 miles away. The doctors couldn't explain what happened to me. My hair had turned completely white, and sometimes I still see things moving in the shadows. Laura told me what happened after I did the ritual. As they ran from the cave, the fog turned black as ink. The ground shook, and all those voices, thousands of them, screamed at once. She practically carried both kids up the muddy road to our car. The engine started on the first try, like it had never been stuck at all. Old Bill disappeared that day. They never found his cabin again. It was like it vanished into the fog, along with all his newspapers and research. The only proof we have is that old journal, which Laura grabbed as they escaped. Most of its pages are blank now, like the words just faded away. David recovered mostly. He doesn't remember anything from his time in the cave, and maybe that's for the best. But sometimes he wakes up screaming, thinking he hears voices calling his name. We kept him in therapy for years. Alice is different. She's herself again, but she notices things that others don't. She can tell when someone's lying just by listening to their voice. And sometimes, when she thinks no one's watching, I catch her whispering to her reflection in mirrors, like she's checking to make sure it's really her. The government got involved after our story got out. They closed off the entire valley, put up fences and warning signs about toxic gas from the old mines. But I know the real reason. Every few years, I hear about hikers who ignore the warnings and go in anyway. They never come back. I still work as a geology professor, but I stay far away from caves now. My hair never turned back to its original color, and the doctors say the tremor in my right hand will probably never go away. Small price to pay for my family's lives. Laura and I moved to Arizona after that summer. Somewhere dry and open, where fog can't hide anything. Somewhere far from mountains and caves and ancient, hungry things that steal voices. But sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear them calling. And when the fog rolls in, I make sure all our doors and windows are locked. Because I know they're still out there, still hungry. And worst of all, some of them are still wearing my face, using my voice, trying to call others into the dark. If you are ever in West Virginia and you hear someone calling your name from a foggy valley, someone who sounds exactly like someone you love, don't answer. Don't look back. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once they learn your voice, they never forget it. And they're always, always hungry. My name is James Walker, and this happened to me back in 1979 in northern Maine, near the Canadian border. I still have nightmares about it. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, my hands shaking as I reach for the bottle next to my bed. But I need to tell this story about what happened to me, my son Tommy, and how our winter camping trip turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. Back then, I was a mess. My wife Sarah had died just 8 months before in a car crash, leaving me alone to raise our 12-year-old son. I used to be a forest ranger, proud of my job and the life we had. But after Sarah's death, I couldn't keep it together. I started drinking too much, missed work too often, and eventually lost my job. The worst part was watching Tommy drift away from me. He stopped talking much, spent all his time drawing in his room, and his eyes, God, his eyes looked so lost and sad. That December, I decided we needed to get away. Just me and Tommy, like the camping trips we used to take when Sarah was alive. I borrowed my brother's RV, packed our winter gear, and told Tommy we were going on an adventure. He didn't say much, just nodded and brought along his sketchbook and colored pencils. He never went anywhere without them anymore. I had no idea then that this trip would change our lives forever. No idea about the ancient evil sleeping in those woods, or how it would smell our grief and pain like a shark smells blood in the water. No idea that every mile we drove north was taking us closer to something hungry, something that had been waiting for a broken family just like ours. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it all started. On that cold December morning when we pulled into Pete's Diner on Route 11, our breaths coming out in white clouds, and the first snowflakes beginning to fall. The diner was quiet that morning, just a few locals hunched over their coffee cups. The waitress, Mary, her gray hair tied back in a messy bun, brought us hot chocolate with extra marshmallows for Tommy. It was the first time I'd seen him smile in weeks. "You folks heading up to Blackwood Vale?" Mary asked, refilling my coffee cup. Her hand paused mid-pour, and something flickered across her face. Worry. Maybe fear. "Yeah, thought we'd do some winter camping," I said. "Got the RV all set up." She glanced at Tommy, who was drawing something in his sketchbook, then leaned in close to me. "3 hikers went missing up there last month," she whispered. "Never found them. Might want to pick another spot." I shrugged it off. I used to be a ranger. I knew these woods. But then Pete Morrison walked in, snow dusting his old hunting jacket. I remembered Pete from my ranger days. He was the best tracker in the county, knew every trail and animal track. When he saw us, his weathered face turned serious. "James Walker," he said, pulling up a chair. "Didn't expect to see you up here." He looked at Tommy, then back at me. "Listen, it here is something you should know about Blackwood Vale. The native folks around here, they won't go near it, especially in winter." Tommy had stopped drawing. His pencil hung in midair as he listened. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound casual for Tommy's sake. Pete lowered his voice. Here is old burial grounds up there. Real old. And sometimes when the winter gets deep and dark," he stopped, looking uncomfortable. "Just, maybe find somewhere else to camp." But I didn't listen. I was too stubborn, too sure of myself. We finished our breakfast, and I drove us up the snow-covered logging road toward Blackwood Vale. Tommy pressed his face against the window, watching the trees grow thicker and darker. That's when he started drawing again. I glanced at his sketchbook and felt my stomach twist. The page was filled with a tall, skeletal figure standing among the trees. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was full of sharp, hungry teeth. "It's just a drawing," I told myself. "Just his imagination." God, I wish I had been right. We found a nice spot near a frozen lake, and there was another RV already parked there, the Hendersons. They seemed like such a normal, happy family. John and Lisa Henderson, with their 2 kids around Tommy's age. They were roasting marshmallows when we pulled up and invited us to join them. That was the last normal evening we would have, because when night fell, everything changed. And it started with those scratching sounds on our RV roof. I woke up around midnight to a sound I'll never forget, like long fingernails dragging across metal. At first, I thought it was just tree branches scraping the RV's roof. But tree branches don't move against the wind, and they don't make sounds that sound almost hungry. Tommy was already awake in his bunk, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Dad," he whispered, "something's up there." I grabbed my flashlight and tried to stay calm. "It's probably just a raccoon," I said, but my hands were shaking as I pulled on my boots. The scratching got louder, more deliberate, like whatever was up there knew we were listening. I opened the RV door, and the cold hit me like a slap. The moonlight made the snow glow blue-white, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall and thin, sliding down the side of our RV. But when I turned my flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. Just our breath in the frozen air and the endless dark of the woods. The next morning, I found strange tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, not human tracks, but something in between. They led straight to the Hendersons' RV. When I knocked on their door, nobody answered. "Maybe they went hiking," I told Tommy. But their car was still there, and so was all their camping gear. And on their door were those scratch marks. I radioed for help, and Pete showed up first. The moment he saw the tracks and the scratches, his face went pale. "It's awake," he said, his voice shaking. "The Wendigo. It smells your pain, James, your grief. That's what it feeds on first before." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to, because that's when we found the blood in the snow. A lot of blood, leading into the woods, and pieces of what looked like. I can't even say it. I just thank God Tommy was in the RV drawing and didn't see it. Pete grabbed my arm hard. "Listen to me," he said. "It's not just a monster that eats people. It gets inside them first, makes them hungry. So hungry they'd do anything, eat anything. And it loves children most of all. Their pain tastes sweetest." I looked back at the RV where Tommy sat drawing. His latest picture showed a family of 4, but their faces were all wrong, stretched and hungry, with too many teeth. A search party arrived that afternoon. 5 local men with rifles and radios. They looked confident, almost cocky. "We'll find your missing family," they promised. They didn't know what was waiting in those woods. None of us did. Not really. One by one, the search party's radios went silent. First Mark, the youngest, who was checking near the lake. Then Steve and Bill by the old logging trail. We heard screams, gunshots, then nothing. Just static. I locked Tommy in the RV. telling him not to open the door for anyone but me. But something was changing in him. He wouldn't eat, said he wasn't hungry, at least not for regular food. I caught him staring at my arm once in a way that made my skin crawl. "Dad," he whispered that night, his voice different, raspy. "I am so hungry, but not for food. I am hungry for." He started crying. I don't want to say it. I don't want to think it. Pete pulled me aside the next morning. "Look at his fingers," he said. Tommy's fingertips were turning black like frostbite, but it wasn't cold enough for that. And his eyes, they were starting to sink into his face, like someone who hadn't eaten in weeks. "The Wendigo," Pete explained. "It doesn't just eat you, it possesses you, makes you become like it. And once it starts, here is no stopping it. Unless what? Unless you kill them before they turn completely." His voice was heavy. "I've seen it before, James, 20 years ago. A little girl, her father waited too long. By the end, she wasn't his daughter anymore. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Kill my own son? The last piece of Sarah I had left? That's when we heard it. A sound like dozens of people screaming in hunger, but all twisted together. It came from deep in the woods, where the burial grounds were. And Tommy turned toward the sound like he was hearing the world's most beautiful music. "It's calling me, Dad," he said, his voice barely human anymore. "I have to go. I am so hungry." I had to make a choice, and I had to make it fast. Because my son, my little boy who used to draw pictures of butterflies and sunsets, was starting to look at me like I was something to eat. I followed Tommy's tracks through the snow, into the woods where the ancient burial caves were. Pete had given me his old silver knife, said it was the only thing that might work against the Wendigo. My flashlight beam bounced off the cave walls as I went deeper inside. That's where I found what was left of the Hendersons. I won't describe it. I can't. But they were still fresh, and there was something feeding on them. Something that used to be a person, but now was just skin stretched over bones, with black fingers and hollow eyes. "Tommy?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Son?" He was in the corner, hunched over, shaking. When he turned around, his face was changing. His eyes were sinking in, his mouth getting wider, teeth sharper. But he was crying. "Daddy," he sobbed. "I am so hungry. Make it stop. Please make it stop." The tall figure behind him stepped into the light. It was like Tommy's drawings come to life. Impossibly tall, skin like old paper stretched over bones, eyes that were endless and empty. And it was smiling. "Your pain called me. It spoke, but not with words. More like the sound of wind through dead trees. Your grief, your guilt. The boy is mine now." But I remembered what Sarah used to say, that a parent's love is the strongest force in the world. And I knew what I had to do. "Take me instead," I said. "I am the one full of pain, full of grief. Let Tommy go, and you can have me." The thing tilted its head, interested. Tommy reached for me, his fingers now more like claws. "Dad, no." He didn't hesitate. I cut my own arm with the silver knife, letting my blood drip on the cave floor. "Taste my pain," I told the Wendigo. "It's stronger than his. Deeper than his." The creature moved like lightning. I felt its cold hands on me, felt it starting to crawl inside my mind. But I fought it with every happy memory of Sarah, every moment of love for Tommy, and somehow, it worked. I remember Tommy screaming, remember the cave filling with a sound like 1,000 winter storms. Remember the knife in my hand, plunging into my own chest, not to kill myself, but to kill the thing trying to possess me. Then darkness. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. Tommy was there, back to normal, holding my hand. They said Pete found us in the snow and got us help. The official report said it was a bear attack, that we were lucky to survive. But Tommy and I know the truth. Sometimes at night, I still hear scratching sounds on the roof. And Tommy still draws pictures, but now they're of butterflies and sunsets again. We made it out. We're alive. But I never go camping in winter anymore. And if you are ever up in northern Maine, near the Canadian border, Stay away from Blackwood Vale, especially if you are carrying any pain inside you, because something ancient lives in those woods, something that feeds on pain and grief, and it's always, always hungry. My name is Margaret Howard, but everyone calls me Maggie. What I am about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1988, and even now, years later, my hands shake whenever I look at the photos from that time. I was 35 then, working as a wildlife photographer for Nature's Lens magazine, and I thought I had seen everything there was to see in the great outdoors. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. It all started when I got an assignment to photograph the wildlife in Thunder Basin National Grassland in Wyoming. If you've never been there, picture this. Endless waves of golden grass stretching as far as your eyes can see, broken only by the occasional abandoned coal mine or empty ghost town. During the day, it's beautiful in a lonely sort of way. But at night, well, that's when things change. I remember pulling up in my trusty RV, excited about capturing some shots of the pronghorn antelopes I'd heard so much about. The locals at the last gas station had been weird, though, giving me strange looks when I mentioned where I was heading. One old Native American man even refused to give me directions, just shook his head and walked away. I should have paid more attention to those warnings, but you know how it is when you are focused on getting the perfect shot. My first few days were pretty normal. I'd wake up early, drive to different spots in the grassland, and spend hours waiting for the perfect moment to photograph the local wildlife. The prairie dogs were especially cute, popping their heads up from their burrows like tiny sentries. But then came that Wednesday morning, and everything changed. I found the first dead cow at sunrise. Now, I'd seen dead animals before, it's part of the job, but this was different. The cow looked like it had been cut open with surgical precision, its organs laid out neatly beside it like some twisted science experiment. There was hardly any blood, which made no sense at all. That's when I met Daniel Cooper, the local rancher who would end up changing my life forever. He came riding up on his horse, looking exactly like you'd expect a Wyoming rancher to look, worn jeans, dusty boots, and a cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. But there was something off about him. Maybe it was the way his eyes never quite met mine, or how his hand kept touching the strange necklace he wore. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. "Especially not with that camera of yours. Some things don't like being photographed." I laughed it off then. I mean, what else could I do? But later that night, as I sat in my RV looking through my photos, I heard it for the first time, a sound that wasn't quite a wolf's howl and wasn't quite a human scream. And in the distance, strange lights danced across the prairie, lights that moved in ways that nothing should be able to move. That was just the beginning of my nightmare in Thunder Basin. If I had known what was coming next, I would have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I stayed, and what happened after that? Well, it still haunts my dreams to this day. The next morning, I couldn't shake off the weird feeling from the night before. I tried to focus on my work, setting up my camera near a prairie dog town. That's when I noticed something odd. All the prairie dogs were gone. Usually, these little guys are everywhere, chirping and playing. But now there was nothing but empty holes and silence. I decided to drive into town to get some coffee and clear my head. The local diner was almost empty, except for a few regulars and Sheriff Robert Hayes sitting at the counter. He was a big man with gray hair and kind eyes, the type of sheriff you'd expect in a small town. When he saw my camera, he came over to my table. "You must be the photographer everyone's talking about," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Been hearing about you taking pictures out near the Cooper place." I nodded, wrapping my hands around my warm coffee mug. "Yes, I am working on a wildlife piece, but..." I hesitated, then told him about the dead cow I'd found. The sheriff's face got serious. "How many have you found?" "Just the one," I said. "Why? Are there more?" He sighed and pulled out a small notebook. "We've had 6 cases in the past month, all exactly the same. clean cuts, organs laid out, no blood, and that's not all. He lowered his voice. We've had 3 hikers go missing since May. No traces, no bodies, nothing. My stomach turned. Daniel Cooper mentioned something about not being out there alone. Daniel Cooper? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Did he tell you about his history with the land? Before I could answer, the diner's lights flickered. Outside, dark clouds were rolling in fast, too fast to be natural. The sheriff looked out the window and stood up quickly. Miss Howard, he said, his voice tight with worry, I suggest you find somewhere safe to stay tonight. We've got a storm coming, and... He paused, looking uncomfortable. Strange things tend to happen during storms out here. I drove back to my RV, parked near a group of trees for shelter from the coming storm. As the wind picked up, I started looking through my photos from the past few days. That's when I saw it. In one of the sunset shots of the prairie, there was a figure standing in the distance. It looked human, but something was off about its shape. It seemed too tall, too thin, and its head wasn't quite right. My hand started shaking as I zoomed in on the photo. The figure was looking right at my camera, and even though the picture was a bit blurry, I could swear its eyes were glowing. The wind outside got stronger, making my RV rock slightly. Then I heard it again, that horrible howl scream from the night before. Only this time, it sounded closer, much closer. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked through the RV windows. The storm had brought early darkness, and rain was starting to fall. That's when I saw them, eyes reflecting in the darkness. Not just one pair, but many, surrounding my RV. They were too high off the ground to be normal wolves, and they moved in a way that made my skin crawl. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. I grabbed my camera instead. Maybe if I took pictures of whatever was out there, someone would believe me. But when I looked at the camera screen, it was full of static, like an old television with bad reception. Suddenly, there was a knock at my RV door. Maggie, it's Daniel Cooper. Let me in, quickly. I hesitated. How did he know where to find me? But another howl, closer than ever, made me unlock the door. Daniel rushed in, soaking wet and out of breath. He carried an old rifle and wore that strange necklace I'd noticed before. Now I could see it was made of bones and strange symbols. They're hunting tonight, he said, pulling the curtain shut. I've been tracking them, trying to warn people, but it's different this time. They're not just hunting anyone, they're hunting you. What's hunting me? I whispered. Those things out there, they're not normal wolves, are they? Daniel shook his head slowly. My family. He stopped, looking guilty. We've lived on this land for 4 generations. We knew about them, made deals with them. That's why they left us alone, but now they're getting stronger, and they want more. A scratching sound came from the RV's roof. Something heavy was up there, moving around. Daniel's face went pale. Whatever happens, he said quietly, don't look directly at them. They can get in your head if you do. Make you see things that aren't real. Make you do things. The scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard something that made my blood freeze, a voice, but not quite human, calling my name from outside. Margaret Howard, it said in a sing-song voice. Come out and take our picture. I felt sick to my stomach. How did they know about my photography? Daniel grabbed my arm as I started to back away from the window. We need to get out of here, he whispered. My truck is parked behind those trees, if we make a run for it. But before he could finish, bright lights flooded through the RV windows. At first, I thought someone had come to help us, maybe the sheriff. Then I realized the lights were floating in midair, with no car or flashlight holding them up. My head started to feel fuzzy, like I was dreaming while awake. In the lights, I saw shapes that couldn't be real. People I knew weren't there. Places that couldn't exist in Thunder Basin. Daniel's necklace started glowing faintly, and the visions faded a little. They're trying to get in your head, he said. Here, take this. He pulled off his necklace and put it around my neck. It won't stop them completely, but it helps. That's when we heard tires on gravel, a real car this time. Through the rain-streaked windows, I saw Sheriff Hayes's patrol car pulling up. Relief flooded through me, but Daniel looked even more scared than before. "Something's wrong," he said. "Look at how he's walking." Sheriff Hayes was walking toward my RV, but his movements were all wrong, jerky and stiff like a puppet on strings. When he got closer, I could see his eyes. They were completely black. "Miss Howard," the sheriff called out. But his voice wasn't his own anymore. It sounded like multiple voices talking at once. "We need to discuss those photographs you've been taking." Daniel pulled me toward the RV's back door. "That's not the sheriff anymore," he whispered. "They've taken him. We need to run. Now." "But what about him? We can't just leave him like that." "He's been gone since this morning," Daniel said sadly. "I saw it happen. I hear there's nothing left of him in there now." The not sheriff started banging on the RV door. All around us, those strange wolf creatures were moving closer, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The floating lights spun faster, and my head felt like it was splitting open with visions, horrible things I can't even describe. "Run," Daniel said, throwing open the back door. "Run as fast as you can. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. Head for the old mines. They hate going underground." "What about you?" I asked, clutching his necklace. He gave me a sad smile and picked up his rifle. "My family helped bring them here. Maybe it's time a Cooper helped send them back." The door burst open, and everything happened at once. I ran into the rain, my feet slipping in the mud. Behind me, I heard gunshots and Daniel yelling something in a language I didn't understand. The wolf things howled, a sound that made my teeth hurt. I didn't look back, just like Daniel said. I just ran. The old mine entrance was ahead of me, a dark hole in the hillside. My flashlight bounced wildly as I ran, showing me glimpses of the rusty rails and broken timbers. Just a little further. Something grabbed my jacket. I screamed and pulled away so hard the jacket ripped. One of those things was right behind me. I caught a glimpse of long arms and too many teeth. But Daniel was right. It stopped at the mine entrance, pacing back and forth like it was afraid to come in. I ran deeper into the mine, my flashlight beam showing the way. The tunnel went down and down, the air getting colder. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. My light caught something ahead, an old elevator shaft, the bottom, lost in darkness. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady footsteps. Maggie. It was Sheriff Hayes' voice, but wrong. Like three people talking at once. "Don't you want to see what we really look like? Just one picture. That's all we need." I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to breathe. The flashlight beam reflected off puddles on the ground, making weird shadows dance on the walls. The footsteps came closer. Then I heard another voice, Daniel's voice, shouting from somewhere above ground. "Maggie, the necklace! Throw it down the shaft!" The possessed sheriff was almost around the corner. Without thinking, I pulled off Daniel's necklace and threw it as hard as I could into the elevator shaft. There was a flash of blue light, like lightning underground. The whole mine shook. I heard screams, not just from the sheriff, but from all of them. The wolf things, the lights, everything. It was like the whole world was screaming. The ground shook harder. Rocks started falling from the ceiling. I ran back the way I came, stumbling and sliding in the dark. My flashlight was dead now, but I could see light ahead, real daylight. Behind me, the screaming got quieter and quieter, like something was pulling them all down into the earth. I burst out of the mine just as the entrance collapsed. The storm was over, the sun was rising, and everything was quiet, normal quiet, like all the horrible things had just been a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. Daniel's truck was still there, empty. The sheriff's car was parked at a crazy angle, driver's door open, and my camera had caught everything. I developed those pictures later, after I left Thunder Basin. Most of them were ruined, just black smudges or weird lights. But one came out clear. It shows Daniel, standing in front of my RV, looking at something off camera. His face is sad but determined, like he knew what was coming. I've never gone back to Thunder Basin. I switched to photographing weddings and family portraits, nice, safe things. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear that howl scream again, and I know they're still out there, waiting for someone else to take their picture. As for Daniel's necklace, well, the mine collapse filled in that old shaft, buried it under tons of rock, and that's probably for the best. Some things should stay buried. But I keep his photo on my desk, just to remember, just to remind myself that not all monsters look like monsters, and not all heroes ride off into the sunset. Sometimes they just disappear into the dark, taking their family's secrets with them. My name is Thomas Grant, and this happened to me in the summer of 1973. I've kept it secret all these years, but now I think it's time to share what my daughter Emily and I experienced in the Olympic National Forest. Some nights, when the wind blows through the trees just right, I can still hear those whispers. I was a different man back then. Broken, really. My wife Sarah had passed away 6 months earlier, and both Emily and I were still trying to figure out how to live in a world without her. Emily had just turned 13, and I could see Sarah in every one of her expressions, in the way she tucked her hair behind her ears when she was thinking hard about something, in her quiet strength that seemed so much bigger than her years. I thought a camping trip might help us heal. That's what I told myself anyway. Sarah had always loved the outdoors, and Emily had inherited that same spark of adventure. Maybe somewhere in those ancient forests, among trees that had stood watch for hundreds of years, we could find a way to feel close to her again. Looking back now, I wonder if Sarah was guiding us there all along, knowing what we would find in those hidden valleys where the loggers had never reached. We had no idea then that the forest had been waiting for us, or that the strange stone circles hidden among the ferns held secrets older than the trees themselves. We didn't know that Emily's nightmares were more than just dreams, or that the shadows moving at the edge of our campfire weren't just tricks of the light. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, on that misty morning when we first turned off the main highway and onto the old logging road. That's when everything started to change, though we didn't know it yet. That's when the forest first began to whisper. The logging road wasn't on any of our maps. It was barely wide enough for our old station wagon, with branches scraping against the windows like fingers. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat, her forehead pressed against the glass, watching the fog drift between the massive trees. "Dad," she said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "Did you see that?" I slowed the car down. "See what, honey?" "I thought I saw." She frowned, squinting into the mist. "Never mind. It looked like someone walking between the trees, but it was too tall to be a person." I tried to laugh it off, but something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Probably just a shadow from the trees," I said, but I found myself driving a little slower, paying more attention to the dark spaces between the trunks. The campsite we found was perfect, maybe too perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal-clear stream bubbling nearby. As I set up our tent, Emily wandered around the edge of the clearing, staying where I could see her. "Dad," she called out, "come, look at this." I walked over to where she was standing. At first, I didn't see anything special, just some rocks peeking through the moss. But then I noticed how they were arranged, a perfect circle, about 15 feet across. The stones weren't very big, but they were placed with obvious care, each one exactly the same distance from the next. "Did someone make this?" Emily asked, reaching out to touch one of the stones. Just before her fingers made contact, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, like a giant branch breaking somewhere in the forest. Emily jumped back, and I pulled her close. We both stood there, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Maybe we should find another spot," Emily whispered. But even as she said it, I could tell she didn't really want to leave. There was something about this place that pulled at us, like a half-remembered dream. "Let's stay," I said finally. "But we'll be careful, okay? We'll stay close to camp." As we walked back to finish setting up our tent, I glanced over my shoulder at the stone circle. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw a faint blue light flickering between the stones, like St. Elmo's fire. But when I looked again, it was gone. That night, as we sat around our campfire roasting hot dogs, Emily kept looking into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. I was about to ask what she was watching when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping in the distance, like footsteps from something very, very large. "Dad?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "It's probably just an elk," I said, trying to sound confident. But I knew elk didn't walk quite like that. The thumping got closer, then stopped suddenly. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, much closer than I expected. Emily grabbed my hand, and then we heard something that changed everything. A sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. It was like someone trying to speak underwater, deep and gurgling and somehow intelligent. Emily's hand tightened around mine. "Dad," she whispered, "I think it's trying to talk to us." I wanted to grab our things and run back to the car, but something kept me there, sitting by that fire with Emily's hand in mine. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was because, deep down, I felt like we were meant to be here. The strange sound came again, closer this time. Emily sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on something in the darkness that I couldn't quite see. "Hello?" She called out softly, before I could stop her. The response was immediate, a low rumbling noise that made the cups by our feet vibrate. Then we heard movement in the bushes, and I saw something that made my heart stop. A pair of eyes reflecting our firelight, way too high up to be any normal animal. They had to be at least 8 feet off the ground. That's when we met Jack Wilson. He came crashing through the undergrowth with a flashlight and a camera around his neck, making so much noise that whatever was watching us disappeared into the darkness. "Did you see it?" he asked excitedly, not even bothering to introduce himself. He was a tall, thin man with wild gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "I've been tracking them for weeks." "Tracking what?" I asked, still holding Emily close. Jack sat down by our fire without asking and pulled out a worn notebook. "The forest people," he said, flipping through pages of messy sketches, "the local tribes have stories about them going back hundreds of years. They say they're not just animals, they can speak, think even." He glanced at Emily. "Reach into people's dreams." Emily went very still beside me. "I had a dream last night," she said quietly, "about the stone circle. There were lights dancing around it, and I could hear voices speaking in words I didn't understand." Jack's eyes lit up, but I cut in before he could say more. "It's late," I said firmly, "and we don't even know who you are." He looked embarrassed for a moment. "Dr. Jack Wilson, cryptozoologist. I study animals that most people don't believe in, and something big is happening in these woods. People have been disappearing. Hikers, loggers, even a whole research team last month. Disappearing?" I felt my mouth go dry. "Not dead," Jack said quickly, seeing my expression. "Just gone. Like they walked into the mist and never walked out. And it all started when the logging companies tried to move into this valley." That's when Emily gasped. We all turned to look where she was pointing. At the edge of our firelight, arranged in a perfect line, were 3 large footprints that definitely hadn't been there before. Each one was at least 16 inches long. But what really made my skin crawl was what was in the middle of each footprint. Small blue flowers that seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. Flowers that hadn't been there seconds ago, growing impossibly fast right before our eyes. "Dad," Emily whispered, "I saw these flowers in my dream." That night, none of us slept much. Jack set up his own tent nearby, promising to explain more in the morning. Every noise from the forest seemed louder than usual, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. But the large footsteps we'd heard earlier didn't return. I woke up just before dawn to find Emily's sleeping bag empty. My heart jumped into my throat until I saw her sitting outside the tent, wrapped in her blanket, staring at the stone circle. The blue flowers from last night had spread, making a path from our campsite to the circle of stones. "They're talking to each other," Emily said without turning around. "The trees, I mean. I can feel it." I sat down beside her, trying to stay calm, even though her words sent chills down my spine. What do you mean, honey? It's like humming in my head, and sometimes there are pictures. She looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her 13 years. Dad, they're worried about something. The forest is scared. Before I could respond, Jack emerged from his tent. He looked like he hadn't slept either. The tribal elders warned me this might happen, he said, sitting down with us. They said the forest would choose someone, a bridge between our world and theirs. He looked at Emily with an expression I didn't quite trust. Tell me, what else have you been feeling? But right then, we heard engines in the distance. Multiple vehicles getting closer. No, 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 Jack muttered, suddenly scrambling to pack his things. They weren't supposed to find us this quickly. Who wasn't? I asked, standing up and pulling Emily closer. Government research team. They've been following me, trying to find evidence of. He stopped as two black SUVs came into view through the trees. Emily grabbed my hand. Dad, we need to run. Now. What? Why? Because they're not here to study the forest, she said, her voice shaking. They're here to capture them. And the forest won't let that happen. As if responding to her words, the ground began to tremble. The blue flowers started glowing brighter, and a deep rumbling sound came from all around us, like dozens of huge creatures moving through the trees at once. The stone circle! Emily pulled me toward it. Quick! I hesitated for just a second, but then I saw men with tranquilizer guns getting out of the SUVs. I grabbed our backpacks and ran with Emily toward the circle of stones. Jack followed close behind. Just as we reached the circle, I heard one of the men shout, There they are! And the girl! She's the one we've been waiting for! But their voices seemed to come from very far away, because the air inside the stone circle had started to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Emily stood in the center, her hair floating as if in a gentle breeze, even though the air was perfectly still. It's okay, Dad, she said, taking my hand. They're going to show us the truth now. All of it. That's when the forest around us exploded into blue light, and I saw them clearly for the first time. Huge, shadowy figures moving between the trees. They were beautiful and terrifying all at once, and they were coming straight toward us. The creatures were tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with long arms and thick dark fur that seemed to shimmer with tiny points of blue light, like stars in their own private night sky. Their faces were almost human-like, with deep, intelligent eyes that glowed with the same blue light as the flowers. Don't be afraid, Emily said softly, though I could feel her hand trembling in mine. They're showing me why they're here. The largest of the creatures stepped forward into the stone circle. In my head, I heard a sound like distant thunder forming into words. The forest remembers. The forest protects. The forest chooses. Jack started taking pictures frantically, but his camera sparked and died in his hands. This is unprecedented, he shouted. Do you know what this means? We could be famous. We could. No, Emily said firmly, in a voice that wasn't quite her own. That's not why we're here. The government agents were getting closer, but they seemed unable to enter the stone circle. The air around us had become like rippling water, and their shouts sounded far away. That's when Jack showed his true colors. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, something that looked military grade. Sorry, Thomas, he said, not sounding sorry at all. But this is too important. The government's paying a lot to understand how these creatures communicate, and your daughter is the key. He reached for Emily, but before I could stop him, one of the creatures moved, faster than anything that big should be able to move. It swept Jack off his feet with one long arm. He dropped the device, which sparked and smoked when it hit the ground. The forest remembers, the thunder voice said again in our heads. Your kind has tried to cage us before, to steal our secrets, to control what cannot be controlled. Through the shimmering air, I could see more creatures emerging from the trees, dozens of them. The ground trembled with their footsteps, and the blue lights in their fur pulsed like heartbeats. Dad, Emily whispered, they're saying we have to make a choice. Right now. The forest is waking up, really waking up for the first time in hundreds of years. They need someone to help them protect it. To be a bridge. I looked at my daughter, understanding slowly dawning. They want you to stay. She squeezed my hand. They want us to stay, both of us. They say, Mom led us here. That she knew, somehow. The largest creature held out its hand, massive but somehow gentle. In its palm was a cluster of the blue flowers, glowing like tiny stars. If we do this, I said carefully, what happens next? We become part of the forest, Emily said. Part of its story. We help protect it, and it protects us. But we can never tell anyone what we've seen. Never let anyone try to capture them or study them again. Outside the circle, Jack was screaming about lost opportunities and government contracts. The agents were trying to break through the shimmering barrier with their equipment. But inside our circle of stones, time seemed to stand still as I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She was scared, yes, but there was something else in her eyes, something like hope. Are you sure about this? I asked her softly. Emily nodded. Mom would want us to protect them, to protect the forest. She reached out toward the glowing flowers in the creature's massive palm. And Dad, I think this is why we felt so lost without her. We were supposed to find this place. Just then, Jack did something desperate and stupid. He grabbed one of the agent's guns and fired at the barrier. The bullet hit the shimmering air and bounced back, catching him in the shoulder. He fell with a cry of pain and chaos broke loose. The creatures moved as one, raising their arms to the sky. The blue lights in their fur grew so bright it hurt to look at them. The ground started shaking harder than ever, and trees began to move, actually move, their roots pulling up from the ground like giant legs. Now, the thunder voice said in our heads. Choose now. Emily took my hand. Together? I thought about our empty house back in the city, about all the nights we'd both spent crying, about how Sarah had always said everything happens for a reason. I squeezed Emily's hand, and together we reached for the glowing flowers. The moment we touched them, the world exploded into blue light, and a feeling like electricity ran through my whole body. I could suddenly feel everything, every tree, every plant, every living thing in the forest. I could feel their thoughts, their memories, their dreams. And most amazingly, I could feel Sarah somehow, like she was all around us in the wind and the trees and the earth itself. The creatures, who I now knew were called the forest people, moved around us in a circle. Their fur sparkled with starlight, and their eyes held centuries of wisdom. Through our new connection, they showed us everything. How they'd protected these woods for thousands of years. How they'd watched humanity grow and spread. How they'd hidden themselves away as their forests were cut down one by one. This valley was one of their last refuges. They needed our help to keep it safe, to be a bridge between their world and ours. Not to reveal their existence, but to help guide humans away from this sacred place, to protect both worlds by keeping them separate. The government agents retreated, dragging a wounded and raging Jack with them. I knew they'd be back eventually, with more people and more equipment. But by then, we'd be ready. That was 50 years ago. Emily and I still live in these woods, in a cabin that most hikers can't quite seem to find. The forest people taught us their ways, their magic, their deep connection to nature. Emily grew up to become something remarkable. Not quite human anymore, but not quite like them either. Something new, something in between. Sometimes families camping nearby will catch glimpses of strange lights between the trees, or hear weird sounds in the night. But all they ever find are circles of blue flowers growing in impossible places. And if they listen very carefully, they might hear whispers in the pines, the forest telling its ancient stories to anyone who's ready to listen. As for me, I am an old man now, but the forest keeps me strong. On quiet nights, Emily and I sit outside our cabin and watch the forest people dance with lights in their fur. And sometimes, in the way the wind moves through the trees, I can still hear Sarah laughing, knowing she led us exactly where we needed to be. The forest remembers, the forest protects, and now so do we.